This is a continuation of a verse-by-verse study through the book of Daniel. I'm up to Daniel 1:6. Going verse by verse through the Bible is the slowest but yet most thorough way of understanding the Bible. Plus, doing these videos helps me because when you actually teach the Word, you learn while you're teaching it. And I just hope it's a blessing to you. So the format here is sort of kind of like we're sitting in a table in an informal setting and not preaching per se, just reading through the Word, enjoying the Word, getting a blessing from the Word. And I'm up to Daniel 1:6, and so far in here, Nebuchadnezzar has besieged Jerusalem, and he's taken hundreds of people over to Babylon, and his attempt is to brainwash them into their culture, try to get them to forget their Hebrew culture. So in the first captivity, the first group of people, they took the royal seed, and they took 3,023 people. 3,023, Jeremiah 52. On the second one, they took another 832 people. That's when Ezekiel was taken. And then in the third one, 745. So it brought the total 4,600 people were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now Daniel and his buddies, they were in the first installment. And in verse 6 it says, "Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." That's their Hebrew names. Now, a name has a meaning. And Daniel, his name means God is my judge. The E-L at the end of his name is God. God is my judge. Hananiah, his name means Jehovah is gracious. I put these in the center column. And then Mishael, the E-L at the end, again, is God, and his name means who is what God is. And then Azariah means Jehovah is keeper. And now a person could run through those names, and you could probably get a message out of that. Some practical message, some devotional message. But there they are. And these boys are probably teenage boys. They're teenagers, and they were ripped out of their culture, and no doubt at night they would express their frustration, and maybe they were disappointed with God at certain times and question why this and why that. But evidently they overcame bitterness and were greatly used of the Lord in Babylon, instead of this tragic thing happening to them becoming a stumbling block, it became a stepping stone. Now in verse 7 it says, "On whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names." Now we just read through that and we don't think about that, but can you imagine the eunuch? I mean, think about that. What these boys experienced. They were not afforded the blessing of having children, being married and having children. There's no record of it, but obviously they couldn't after that happened to them. So then it says, "For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar." So the master of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, obviously, they followed orders. They wanted to get rid of that Jewish name. Why? Because, in Romans 8, or Romans 1, remember that a sign of society going down the tubes is that they don't even want to retain God in their knowledge. And so their names just reminded them of God. So Belshazzar, Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar. Very similar to Belshazzar, but Belteshazzar. And the B-E-L, Bel, protect his life, that's the name of their pagan deity, which is akin to Allah. The next one, Hananiah, his name was changed to Shadrach. And his name means the decree of the moon god, Allah. The moon god. There we go. That's where this came through, where they had multiple gods, but then, of course, Mr. Muhammad, got them down to one, the moon god. And then Mishael, his name was changed to Meshach. His name means drawing out. And Azariah, his name was changed to Abednego, and that's how most people know them or remember them, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And his name means servant of Nebo, or light. Light meaning the hidden light. That's what the Freemasons are claiming to be following, which they're hoodwinked and deceived. But here's the amazing thing about Daniel. A young fella, and it says Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So evidently that meat and wine had something deeper involved with it, meaning they probably offered it as a sacrifice to their pagan deities, and Daniel wanted nothing to do with that. Now for him, he purposed in his heart, but is he going to be able to keep his conscience pure in this matter? Well, he obviously realized that if he doesn't follow orders, that they just might, give him the, across the throat, and they wouldn't hesitate in doing that. But notice it says, therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Notice he didn't demand. Now what this in 1:8 reveals, it basically reveals, well, one, the Bible does not teach blind loyalty or obedience to any institution of man, including government. It doesn't teach that. All through the Bible, you'll find certain characters where they stood against the so-called laws of governing authorities. And most laws of government is nothing more than an opinion backed by a gun. Now what Daniel does, he reveals the proper steps to appeal to a wicked command of one's authority, be it in a school, be it in a governing setting, be it in your workplace of employment. So he reveals the proper steps that one appeals in these matters. In the political world, this would be called a redress of grievances. This is something in American culture. And so Daniel, the first step is the inward desire to please God and to keep a pure conscience. It's not to be a rebel. It's not to, I got my rights. It's not demanding anything. It's just that if I proceed down this path, it's going to violate my conscience. And when my conscience is violated, then it's going to hurt my relationship with my God. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. There's the motive. There's the inner motive of this. He wasn't being a smart aleck. He wasn't being a rebel. He just wanted to be able to walk with his God without hindrance of his conscience being violated. And so what he did is he appealed. He didn't demand. He didn't throw a fit. Now, in order for him to appeal, he requested. He obviously had to have some cooperative character within himself in his very difficult setting. Okay, no doubt of those 3,000, there were people who were arguing, yelling, screaming, fighting, challenging the military authority, complaining. But in verse 9 it says, now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now, obviously God was involved in that, but Daniel obviously showed his concern, compassion for his superior, and he was cooperative in a place that he could be cooperative, and he was brought into tender love. It's kind of like Esther. When Esther was brought into that situation. No doubt all the other females, or many of the other females, were, scratching, trying to get what they could out of this situation, get all the money, all the clothes, and they were arguing and screaming. And Esther just went through it as she had to go through it with her quiet spirit. And the one in charge saw that, and he pushed her up into the lead, and she eventually becomes queen. So obviously these two, Esther and Daniel, and probably Joseph, in a very difficult situation, they had a quiet submission to their Lord. And they had a quiet submission to the powers that be. And that attitude brought them into good graces, in Daniel's case, with Melzar. And so then when he did request, he had a request, he obviously had to take into consideration the concerns of Melzar, because if Daniel wasn't going to follow orders, Melzar was going to get in trouble. So he had a plan of action here. And he didn't want to endanger the position of Melzar, but yet he also sought the best he could to not violate his conscience. So in this case, God intervened. In Daniel 3, his three friends, well, they stood up against it, what they call civil disobedience, peacefully. Not like the Black Lives Matter movement where they have fire in the background. They're saying they're not destroying anything. And they stood up, and then God intervened. And the same with Daniel in Daniel 6. So attitude plays a lot in this, plus one's motive, their conscience. Okay, so the first step Daniel followed was the inward desire to please God, and then the second was he displayed a relationship of cooperation and came into favor with the authority. And his third method was a humble appeal to try another method. He didn't want to defile his conscience. He's just asking, is there another method? Is there something else we could do here? So in verse 10, the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? See, so this guy assumed this was a government that recommended daily allowance. You're going to be healthy when you follow this method. And in reality, no, you're not. But he assumed that. And so Daniel is going to take his fear in consideration to try to get an alternative approach. He says, then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. So that's obviously his fear, because that's how governments work. It's through fear and intimidation. So then he just said, okay, let's keep a consideration. He kept the consideration of the concerns and obligations of the authority. And then his fifth step was he proposed a time of testing for the alternative plan, which no doubt he and his friends prayed that God would intervene. So in verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You see, the Bible still uses their Hebrew names. And he said, prove thy servants. So this is just a test. I beseech thee 10 days. A very short-lived test. After 10 days, okay, then we'll figure something else out here. And let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So this pulse is not, it's kind of a vegetarian diet. Pulse is more of like beans, peas, lentils. Okay, and that's kind of what they were requesting. And of course, in Melzar's mind, he's thinking, they're going to get all weak and sickly, and then I'm going to be in trouble. But in 10 days, he said, okay, let's give it a try. And he knew that Daniel cared for him. Daniel was taking his best interests at heart also, meaning Melzar's. At the same time, Daniel was didn't want to defile himself. So in verse 13 it says, "Then let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest. Deal with thy servants." So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. In the 10 days their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Why? That heavy diet takes away energy. And the easier digestible diet that Daniel was suggesting, and that he probably experienced back in Judah, allowed them to have more energy. You see, an ordinary meal can be a good testimony for God. You just don't know. And especially when the eating habits of society, the normal eating habits, are not really good and healthy habits. So, there's times all of us were under someone's authority, and there's a hierarchy. And there's times where the hierarchy will order something not as good as it should be, and the one under the authority can appeal to them in a gracious, humble manner. Why? The purpose is so you don't defile your conscience. Okay, we'll try to finish out the chapter here. In verse 17, we got a paragraph mark. So the test is done, over with. Melzar has a greater relationship with Daniel and his buddies, where Melzar felt like, okay, they have my best interest at heart, but yet, and so therefore I can return the favor and have what they feel is their best interest. I may not, I'm not going to eat what they eat, but hey, if it's good for them, that's okay. Now in 17, as for these 4 children of Israel, like I say, probably teenagers, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. God is the one that gave them the ability to learn. Common sense. Wouldn't that be something good to pray for? How about that? Lord, please give me knowledge. Give me skill in all. Help me to learn quickly. Okay, and often you learn quickly through analogies. And then Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Understanding is what inspiration is. If you go with the very first time inspiration is found in the Bible, and it's only found 2 times, so it's pretty easy to define. Job 32:8. But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. The scholars limit inspiration to the writing or the verbal speaking of the scriptures, where in the Bible, inspiration is when you understand the scriptures. That's why it's present tense. That is the perfect pattern for a public meeting. Look at all them P's. Perfect pattern, public meeting, perfect pattern. You'll find it in Nehemiah 8:8. And this is page 777 in a good reference Bible. And it gives a 3-point outline of a pattern for a public service. So Nehemiah 8:8. So they read in the book of the law of God distinctly. So that's what we're doing. We're reading. Gave the sense. Okay, so you're given the sense by application, illustration, comparing Scripture with Scripture. When that's done right, it says, and cause them to understand the reading. There's inspiration. When that is done right, you know what a person will say? Now that makes sense. Okay, that's what it is, common sense. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And what that is, that's God making his words known before there's written revelation. So there's a bunch of those throughout Daniel. You find the authority for that in Numbers 12:6. So now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, so 3 years, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's their Hebrew names. Therefore stood they before the king. So they knew royal protocol. You see, they're not compromising, knowing royal protocol. No compromise there. But yet they could explain things clearly and simply. Give good, honest answers. Verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Now, you'll know as we come through here, he will seek counsel for those two clowns, groups of clowns, magicians and astrologers, because that's what government does. Government officials often seek after the stars. It's because Satan is the one ruling in the kingdom of heaven. But even at that, when common sense stood out, these boys stood out. And then it says in Daniel, continued even in the first year of King Cyrus. That would be of Media Persia. So 70 years, according to Daniel, 70, or according to Jeremiah, they were going to be subjects under Babylon for 70 years. And then Media Persia was going to follow them. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 1.